Hi, and welcome back to Horror Recapped. Today we're going to explore 1993's When a Stranger Calls Back. Beware, spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. We open up in a neighborhood at night. A car comes to a stop in front of a house. A passenger gets out and walks up to the house, and she goes to ring the bell. Before she can, a man answers the door, and he invites her inside. Now, we can see that the girl is Julia, a babysitter, and the parents go over how long they plan on being away. They don't plan to be back until at least 11:30, and Julia assures them that that's okay with her. The parents rush out of the house, and they lock the door behind themselves. Julia heads into the living room, and she sets down her books that she's going to study. She heads upstairs to check on the kids, and she finds that they are sound asleep already. When she goes back downstairs, she puts on the TV and sits down to watch some MTV. After she gets tired of that, she turns to her study books, but the phone rings suddenly. When she answers the phone, she tells whoever is on the other end that they have the wrong number, and she goes back to studying. As the night goes on, Julia continues to study, but soon there is a knock at the door. She's not expecting the parents yet, but she gets up to see who's there. When she calls out to the person outside, a man answers and tells her that his car has broken down. He asks to come and to use the phone, and Julia almost opens the door. She tries to tell him that she'll call the auto club herself, and she gets a pen and paper to write his message down. He tells her that his name is Steven, and he gives her all of his member information. She goes over to the phone to call the information in, but when she picks up the phone, she finds out that there isn't a dial tone of any kind anymore. She goes back to the door to break the news to Steven, but she decides to make up a lie. She tells him that the tow truck should be there in about an hour, and he thanks her for calling for him. After Julia hears him walk away, she goes to the window to make sure he leaves the premises, and she goes around the house to check the other phones. After finding out that there isn't a dial tone on any of them, she blows it off and goes to put a kettle on. When she looks at the clock, she notices that it's almost 11 o'clock, but suddenly, a knock is heard on the door again. She goes to see who it is, and she hears Steven talking to her through the door again. He tries to see if she'll call the auto club again, and she agrees to call again. She goes to the phone, and this time, she pretends to call. When she goes back to the door, she tries to tell Steven that she called the club again, but this time, he doesn't answer. Julia goes to check on the kids, and she sees that they are sound asleep. When she comes out of the bedroom, she can hear the kettle on the stove. When she goes downstairs to pour her tea, she makes sure the back door is locked. And when she goes to pass the front door, Steven knocks and accuses her of never calling the auto club. When she mentions that she's done everything she can, Steven asks her to call his wife to tell her not to worry. She goes to call and look at her notebook, and she notices that the paper she wrote all Steven's info on is gone. She notices someone rustling outside her window, and she turns to pretend to call again. When Julia goes back to the door, she tells him that there was no answer, and Steven goes on his way. After hearing him walk away, Julia goes to the window to look for him, but she doesn't see him. She flips through her book to see if she misplaced the page with the information, but she can't find it. After making sure the front door is secure, Julia goes around the rest of the house to check all of the windows and doors, and she finds that the sliding door in the kitchen was actually open. After she closes it, Steven knocks on the door again, and he claims that he knows she's the babysitter. He tells her that he saw someone moving around upstairs, and she should get out of the house now. Julia charges upstairs, and she finds that the kids are gone. When she comes back out of the room, she rushes down the stairs to open the front door, and she finds Steven's trench coat lying on the ground. Steven tells Julia to come out, and she notices that she never told him her name. She locks herself back inside, and Steven tells her to look into the living room. Just then, a man creeps out, and Julia bolts outside again. This time, she runs into the arms of the father, and she lets out a blood-curdling scream as the mother gets out of the car. 5 years later, we run into Julia again, but now she's living on her own When she goes into her closet, she's startled to find a children's shirt hanging up, and she runs to the police station where she tries to convince them that the shirt belongs to one of the kids she was babysitting that night. Soon, the police call Jill up, and she introduces herself to Julia. Jill asks her to start from the beginning, and Julia talks about an incident from 4 months ago. She notices that things just weren't where she remembered keeping them in her apartment, but she blew it off. Then she tells them about a night 6 weeks ago where she woke up to an alarm set for 3 a.m., but she didn't set that alarm. Then she gets the shirt in her closet today, but the police don't really see any immediate danger in the situation. They ask Julia to step outside for a moment, and they discuss her previous history. While the police don't believe her, Jill definitely does. Jill invites Julia back to her place, and she opens up about how she had a similar babysitting experience. Jill doesn't think the police will get involved, so she wants to call in an old friend that can. She tells Julia that she can stay there until she feels safe to go back, and that they are going to get through this. Jill's friend, John, comes in on the bus, and Julia tells him about the experience 5 years ago. Then she takes John and Jill back to her apartment, and John collects the child's shirt from the closet. After walking around, Julia tells Jill that she feels good enough to stay there. Later, Julia goes to work at the crisis center, and she heads back to her apartment afterwards. That night, Julia calls Jill to tell her that she thinks she saw someone outside her window, but she lives on the 3rd floor. Jill tells her to make sure her apartment is secure, and she wants her to keep talking the entire time. Julia makes her way through her apartment, and she comes back after making sure everything is locked and empty. Jill then tells her to turn off the light and look out the window. Julia thinks that she imagined everything, but Jill doesn't take any of this lightly. The next morning, Julia wakes up to find her window wide open. Later, she goes to Jill, and Jill takes her to shop for a gun. That night, Julia goes through her apartment and makes sure every bit of it is secure. The next day, Jill can't find Julia anywhere, and she goes to John to see if he has any answers. John thinks that Jill is going about things all wrong, but Jill thinks that this is the only way for Julia. That night, Julia shows up at Jill's apartment, but John stays at the bar to try and piece things together from 5 years ago. The next day, John takes Jill to the house that Julia babysat at 5 years prior, and they try to piece together where there were actually 2 men that night. John believes that it was one man trying to make himself sound like 2, but soon, a police officer shows up to tell them that Julia has shot herself. They rush back to town where they find out that she's miraculously not dead, but the gunshot to the head has put her in a state that they aren't sure she'll survive in the long run. John and Jill head to Julia's apartment to check the crime scene, and Jill finds a notebook that makes Jill feel responsible for this. John can't piece anything together, and he tells Jill that he's going to go home. Before he goes home, John decides to stop at Julia's apartment one more time. He doesn't find anything out of the ordinary other than the fact that Julia's clock is slow. At the hospital, we see a man appear out of the shadows in Julia's room, but soon, Jill walks in and doesn't see anyone. She goes to sit on Julia's bed, and she promises that she's going to find the man responsible for her torment. After she leaves, the man in the shadows comes out and starts to hit her in her stomach. Jill heads to the grocery store, and she starts to notice that someone is putting things in her cart. Suddenly, she hears a man's voice call out to her, but she can't see anyone that would be talking to her. Freaked out, Jill runs outside to try and spot someone, but there's no one. The next day, John goes to a booking agency to try and find a ventriloquist, but he gets sent on a wild goose chase downtown. Meanwhile, William Landis is performing in a club downtown, but its ventriloquist dummy starts to concern some people as it doesn't have a face. William starts to talk about some really deep accusations, and the club owner gets up on the stage and throws him off. He takes William backstage, and he leaves him to fix the toilet. Just then, John walks in the club, and he sees one of the girls about the ventriloquist that was supposed to be performing that night. Just then, William leaves his dummy with one of the showgirls that liked his performance, and the manager comes back to throw him out the back door. Once outside, he runs into John at the end of the alley, but he runs into a side alley to hide. After John can't find him, he heads to William's apartment to see if he still lives there, but the neighbor opens up to tell him that he hasn't lived there in a while. John doesn't fully believe her though, and he goes back to the supposed apartment and breaks in. Back at Jill's office, one of her colleagues stops in to check on her, but Jill tells her that she's just fine. John continues searching the apartment, and he finds all of the makeup that William uses to hide his flesh on stage while he performs. He also finds Polaroids of Julia in her hospital bed that were taken the other night. Some of them are even sexual in nature. After looking through them, John notices some other pictures that seem to be of Jill's apartment. John heads to the payphone to try and connect to Jill's apartment, but the phone line is disconnected. Meanwhile, Jill arrives at her apartment, and she is very cautious. She notices that the milk carton was left out, and she grabs her weapon as the lights get shut off. When she tries to open the door, something is blocking it. Then, she hears William calling her, and she tries to find him. What she doesn't see is that William has painted himself to look like the wall. When she gets close, he jumps out and attacks. But John comes in shortly after. William shoots Jill with her own weapon, and John shoots William down. Jill wakes up in the hospital next to a conscious Julia, and everyone is at peace. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this recap, don't forget to like and subscribe with notifications turned on so you don't miss a single video.